A young woman named Darlene has a date with her boyfriend inside his car, at a lonely lookout point. They start flirting with the intention of making the night more intimate. Suddenly, a Mustang parks behind them and turns off its lights. Darlene comments that there is nothing to worry about, but moments later the man in the car gets out and fires a gun several times until he makes sure the young couple never wakes up again. The most terrifying thing of all is that moments later he calls 911 to report the crime and without revealing his identity adds, "I also finished off those kids last year." Of the two victims, only Michael survives. In the hospital, he gives a description of his attacker, a white and robust man. What he does not know is that just a few days later, the whole country will discover that he was the self-proclaimed Zodiac Killer. A month later in San Francisco, we meet Robert. A divorced man, single father and cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. He drops his son off at school and heads to the office where he has a meeting with the directors and other workers. The day was going normally until the newspaper receives a letter that leaves everyone stunned. This was sent by the criminal who attacked the two young people. To prove it, he reveals details of the crime that only he and the police could know. He also attaches a code of encrypted symbols, explaining that he sent two other versions to different newspapers, and that by joining them his identity will be revealed. The most disturbing thing is that he demands that the codes be published on the front page before August 1st, or he will end the lives of 12 people that weekend. The letter has no name, but it does have a symbol, a circle with a cross in the center. Paul Avery, a crime journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, begins to investigate and becomes interested in the strange code sent by the killer. Robert, for his part, takes a copy of the symbols to analyze on his own. The newspaper decides to publish the encryption to prevent more deaths, and dozens of linguistic teams, investigators, and intelligence centers across the country focus on deciphering it. After a few days, a history professor and his wife manage to solve much of the code. Paul shares the result with Robert. The killer does not reveal his name, only leaves a disturbing message that is essentially a threat but does not reveal his real name. Robert notices that some symbols remain unsolved and tries to decipher them, which impresses Paul quite a bit. At that moment, another letter arrives from the criminal with more details of his crimes, and for the first time signs as Zodiac. As many already know, this movie is inspired by a real-life case, the famous Zodiac Killer, who began to terrorize people in the 1960s in Northern California. His case has been described as possibly the most famous serial killer case in the United States, even surpassing Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. The encrypted letters he sent to the press, the threats to school buses, and the three crimes we will see in this story unfortunately happened in real life. In fact, this is a movie with very documentary-like tones as it narrates many things as they actually happened. Perhaps the most important difference is the character of Paul, who did exist, but did not even work with Robert in real life. These two met much later, and much of their story within this movie was modified to add more drama to things. I make this clarification because this video will also have a certain documentary inclination, so I clarify this to avoid confusion. Apart from Paul's story, everything else is quite close to reality. In this video we will take the two theories about the true identity of Zodiac, create a kind of criminal profile, and above all, try to understand why. Not why he committed the atrocious acts, but why people are so interested, so intrigued, and so thirsty for curiosity about the topic of serial killers. We will mainly rely on a book titled Why We Love Serial Killers, written by Scott Bunn, a PhD in sociology and criminology. I warn you that in this video we will touch on very sensitive topics, so I recommend taking it easy. A month and a half later we see a couple driving toward a lake where they have a romantic date. Suddenly, a man dressed completely in black with the symbol of the circled cross approaches them with a weapon and asks for their belongings. Then he ties their hands and feet and later puts them on the ground, and once they are defenseless, he pulls out a knife and uses it repeatedly on them. Before disappearing, he goes to the couple's vehicle that was on the road and signs his atrocious act with his symbol and dates. Later, he calls the police again to report what he did. However, the man who was stabbed manages to survive, but since he did not see his face, he cannot give many statements. In the next scene, Robert makes a composite sketch of Zodiac based on the survivor's description. He suddenly remembers a phrase from the killer's letter and associates it with a line of dialogue from a movie. The man is the most dangerous animal to hunt. This is a movie based on a book called The Most Dangerous Game and is about a count who kills for sport and will be important later. Over the days, the conversation about Zodiac becomes a popular topic in the locality and many speculate about his motivations. A taxi driver hears these talks on the radio until suddenly the passenger pulls out a gun. Some children who witness the scene from their window call the police, and two agents arrive who will be very important to the story, Dave and Bill. Dave tries to reconstruct what happened, examines the scene, and interviews the witness children, although their account does not add much. 3 days later, a new letter arrives at the San Francisco Chronicle offices. In it, Zodiac claims the taxi driver event and attaches a piece of his blood-stained clothing as proof. At that moment, detectives Dave and Bill appear, discovering that in the letter the psychopath now threatens to attack children on school buses. The Chronicle decides to publish the letter, but omitting that part. Even so, fear is already sown. As a consequence, Robert prefers to take his son in the car instead of letting him travel by bus. Once we have seen the level of madness these kinds of figures can reach, we will delve more into their mind. People capable of committing such acts usually present a very peculiar configuration known as psychopathy. The psychopath presents specific characteristics in two areas, interpersonal and affective. Interpersonally, there are high levels of narcissism, that is, someone who feels superior to others and entitled to trample others to achieve their own interests, as well as possessing a great capacity for manipulation. Effectively, they are usually incapable of having deep empathy, of putting themselves in another person's place and resonating with their joy or pain. What they do usually have is cognitive empathy, a rational understanding. That is, they understand what you feel but without connecting. They understand what you think but without putting themselves in your place. And that ability is what allows them to manipulate. And for that same reason, being incapable of feeling empathy, they also cannot feel guilt or remorse for what they do because they cannot develop an emotional bond with people. Vicente Garrido, a Spanish psychologist and criminologist, argues that this personality configuration results in the most dangerous human beings who understand the mechanisms to manipulate and are not burdened by doing so because they have no conscience about their acts. The vast majority of human beings navigate life based on feelings toward others, love, friendship, and seeking and giving affection. Much of that governs our behaviors and life goals. In that sense, Garrido proposes the idea that the psychopath is a kind of survivor because he grows up in a world he is unable to understand, and because he cannot feel it, he imitates it. If all his life he sees that people around him rejoice over a certain situation that happened to someone, he also does it, but not because he truly feels it, but because he has learned that it is what should be done. The problem is that many of these people tend to need a substitute for those emotions that give meaning and fulfill most people, but that they are incapable of feeling. And they almost always find that substitute in the feeling generated by having power. Because although they are not capable of generating moral emotions that allow you to bond with others, such as empathy or compassion, they are capable of experiencing more selfish emotions like greed, pleasure, or joy, but a joy linked only to their own benefit. And those sensations they almost always find through dominating, exercising their will, and as I mentioned before, feeling powerful. But then why do some decide to kill people? The answer could be that this search for power can take different paths. Some psychopaths channel that need into environments that provide those feelings of dominance and control. For example, public offices from which they can obtain personal benefits or high positions in business hierarchies where they can command and exercise their will. They can also be found in the legal or political world, where power over decisions affecting thousands of people gives them that sense of superiority they seek. But others develop fantasies of absolute power over life and death, which over time become more intense and specific. The fantasies usually start apparently innocently, like imagining scenarios of revenge, carnal domination, or control over others. And these images produce excitement because for the psychopath they are the only space where they can feel something like pleasure or euphoria. And over the years these fantasies are fed by, not because they are violent, experiences of humiliation or early trauma. The decisive step usually occurs when fantasies are no longer enough. The mind no longer manages to satisfy the need just by imagining, and the psychopath begins to feel an urgency to try in reality what he has already rehearsed in his imagination. And that is when they usually commit horrible acts. That experience reinforces the cycle, and for them it becomes the most intense way of feeling alive and filling that emptiness they carry. In other words, while some psychopaths are found in social manipulation or positions of power, the fuel to feel, others discover that nothing gives them as much power as taking a life. Continuing the search, Dave takes the letters to an expert to look for similarities in the handwriting, while Paul dedicates himself to journalism, writing articles without rest. However, things get complicated when they discover that the survivor from the lookout, the only person who had seen Zodiac and managed to live to tell the tale, has fled the city for fear of reprisals. The only good news is that the investigators find very specific military boot prints at the crime scene. Later, Robert and Paul talk looking for a pattern in the attacks. Meanwhile, Dave and Bill analyze the prints found in the taxi. Both come to the same conclusion. Zodiac is changing his way of acting. He no longer limits himself to young couples in remote places. By killing a taxi driver in the middle of the city, he shows he can choose anyone at any time. This breaks expectations and confuses the investigators, forcing the press and police to play his game where he sets the rules and they only react. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, Dave receives an urgent call. The killer has announced he will speak on a famous television program. Dave leaves his wife in bed and runs to the place with the intention of tracing the call. From home, Robert watches the broadcast on TV, and Paul watches it from the newspaper offices. After a few minutes, Zodiac communicates with the program. He says he suffers from severe headaches. He must be sent to the gas chamber and gives an address where he assures he will be in a couple of hours. But when the press and police arrive at the place, they find no one. Minutes later, Bill informs Dave that they managed to trace the call and it came from a psychiatric center, confirming that it was all false. A week and a half later, new letters arrive at the Chronicle offices. In these letters, Zodiac threatens to make a bomb and mocks the police and media, saying that the school bus thing was a lie and that if they really thought there was something like that, they deserve to have a hole in their heads. During the meeting, Paul invites Robert to the bar. There, Robert explains how they deciphered the code and pulls a copy from his coat that he always carries with him. Paul is surprised that someone carries that everywhere but listens. Robert continues saying that it is just a substitution puzzle, and that he also found a book called the Zodiac Alphabet. Paul is impressed and asks what he is looking for with all this, as he notices that everyone gains something from the case except Robert. The question leaves the young man thoughtful but reveals that Paul, who represents the media, does his job thinking only about his benefit. Later, the killer acts again. He picks up a woman with her baby on the road pretending to want to help her but soon threatens to kill them. Almost miraculously, the woman manages to jump from the vehicle and flee with her son. Weeks later, letters from Zodiac keep arriving confessing his crimes, including the attempted capture of the woman. However, the newspaper decides to stop publishing them to see how they react. During that conversation, Robert tells Paul that he finds it strange that Zodiac confessed to the woman's case months later, and Paul shows something he has discovered. Together, they review the newspaper archives where Paul explains that since the taxi driver's murder, all Zodiac's letters have limited themselves to repeating information published in the press, even claiming a murder whose real culprit was arrested 2 days later, which has led Robert to conclude that he does it only for media attention. He also notes that both the name and the Zodiac symbol already existed in a watch brand. Thus, although the killer claims to have eliminated 13 people, only some of those deaths can be proven to be his, a revelation that fills Robert with disappointment. With this scene, we can begin to build a profile of this enigmatic subject. In criminology, serial killers are divided into organized and disorganized. Disorganized act without planning and leave obvious traces. They usually kill and abandon the body in the same place. They generally have mental or addiction problems, come from dysfunctional environments, and have few social skills. On the other hand, organized killers are closer to the idea most of us have of a serial killer. Their crimes tend to be premeditated, planned, and calculated, so little evidence is usually found at the scene. According to the classification, they are antisocial and almost always psychopaths. They know the difference between good and evil, are not psychotic, and show no remorse. Historically, they tend to be married or live with a stable partner, have a job, be educated, skillful, orderly, cunning, and controlled. Because in a certain social grace they can be charming and even seduce their victims before capturing them. In these cases, there are usually 3 crime scenes, where the victim was approached, where they were killed, and where the body was discarded. They even follow reports of their crimes and communicate with the media. Examples of them are Ted Bundy, Joel Rifkin, and the Zodiac. This is a way to classify how they commit their crimes, but now we move on to the classification of their motivations. That is, why does someone simply decide one day to start killing for no apparent reason or motive people who have never done anything to them? For many years, 3 criminologists named Ronald Holmes, Stephen Holmes, and James DeBurger interviewed serial killers to classify the motivations behind their acts. They discovered that these usually divide into 2 approaches: act-centered or process-centered. Those motivated by the act have the act itself as their goal, so their crimes tend to be quick. They are usually subclassified as visionary and mission-oriented. Visionaries commit their crimes under orders from imaginary voices they perceive as real. They may be from God, demons, or other entities. They usually suffer psychosis or other mental illnesses and normally fall into the disorganized category. One of the most famous examples is Herbert Mullen, who killed 13 people because he believed that by doing so he would prevent an earthquake from sinking California into the ocean. He was captured, confessed the crimes, and claimed that thanks to his sacrifices, a natural disaster had not occurred. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. On the other hand, mission-oriented killers usually convince themselves that through their crimes they will improve the world. They justify themselves by saying that by killing certain sectors such as sex workers, specific ethnic groups, or people with specific sexual orientations, they are saving society. Now let's go with the process-oriented killers, a much more perverse division. First, there are three subclasses of hedonistic killers. The first is the hedonist by lust, focused on the process. They do not kill just for the act but seek pleasure in the ritual and the experience of killing itself. The second is the hedonist of comfort or gain, whose main motive is to obtain material benefits or a more comfortable life. That is, they kill to get money or improve their quality of life. The third is the hedonist by thrill, who finds pleasure in the adrenaline of stalking and generating fear. Finally, there are the most common, those of power and control. They are also process-centered and seek to dominate their victims. They enjoy the suffering they cause, and although the violence may have a carnal component, the true satisfaction comes from deciding slowly and calculatedly when and how they will leave this world. According to some experts, Zodiac can be considered an organized killer with mixed motivations centered on the search for power and control. This is because he was not satisfied with killing. He enjoyed terrorizing an entire city and manipulating the police, newspapers, and public opinion. Recognition was an essential part of his motivation, as he needed to prove that he was not caught behind the crimes and humiliate the authorities by sending evidence and demanding the publication of his messages, thereby controlling the public narrative. His narcissistic game was reflected in the symbol he signed with, in the riddles, and in the victim counts, thus constructing a mythical identity that remains alive decades later. Also, although not all attacks seem to have had a carnal motive, the violence against young couples and the way of terrorizing before killing suggest a sadistic component linked to fantasies of dominance and humiliation. Later, Paul receives a Halloween-themed letter from Zodiac and another piece of the taxi driver's shirt. In the letter, Zodiac threatens Paul, as in his articles Paul had been writing about the killer as a latent homosexual. This fills him with concern for his life, so he gets a gun and practices his aim. In the middle of the conversation, Paul confesses to Robert that he received an anonymous call. The person on the phone invited him at midnight to an abandoned place, assuring he had key information to catch Zodiac. That same night, Robert has a romantic date, but it is spoiled a bit because he can't stop talking about the case. His companion warns him that Paul might be walking straight into an ambush. Luckily, it was not a trap, and Paul gets valuable information. The Riverside case, where years before a young woman named Cherry Jo Bates was murdered, and the local press received letters very similar to those of Zodiac. An expert confirms that the handwriting matches, and with that certainty, Paul appears on television claiming that Zodiac may have started earlier than thought. The news surprises everyone, including the detectives who find out through the press. That move enhances Avery's image as a journalist but makes the police uncomfortable, as public dissemination contaminates the case evidence. That's how Paul and Detective Dave travel to Riverdale to check the clues of the supposed first Zodiac murder, but the evidence is not very conclusive. The problem is that leaving the police office, Dave confronts Paul, as now the whole state believes that this first murder was Zodiac's when it might not be, and all that would do is confuse the investigation further. Paul argues that he should be grateful because no one else could have found that information. To which Dave replies that he is selfish, only looking to increase circulation and be seen, while he as a detective wants to do what matters, solve the case. This seems like a good moment to talk about the role of the media in all this. Scott Bond points out that the media plays a decisive role in how we pursue serial killers. Returning to Stanley Cohen's concept of moral panic, he explains that the media, in alliance with the police and politicians, tend to exaggerate threats and present certain criminals as popular demons. In this process, they are stripped of any human traits and stylized as pure evil figures, much more dangerous in the public imagination than they really are. The cycle is always similar. First, an enemy is constructed, then the threat is magnified until it generates collective alarm. It becomes a justification for more punitive measures that reinforce the image of politicians and law enforcement as the protectors of society. It is a symbiotic relationship, because politicians need the media to communicate their discourse and legitimize themselves as guardians of good, and the media needs sensationalist stories that attract audiences and with them advertising revenue. The problem is that this constant, stylized, and exaggerated coverage, besides creating fear, transforms the image of the serial killer. They cease to be seen only as criminals and become a mythical, almost legendary figure. The names, symbols, and messages of these criminals are repeated so much that they end up embedded in popular culture. As Bond says, the media make them go from criminals to becoming a kind of rock stars of crime. Fascinating not because they did something good, but because the media narrative turns them into celebrities that capture the attention of millions. I wanted to emphasize this moment in the story because here we clearly see how the media, represented in this case by Paul and the newspaper, are affecting what really matters, which is the investigation to catch Zodiac and bring justice to the victim. However, there is another part also affected by all the outrage caused by the media. It is not fully touched on in the movie, but at the end I will tell you why this can become a greater evil. The consequence of having leaked this information is that dozens and dozens of false testimonies begin contacting the police to give their version. Some for fame, others for revenge, but all this only ends up gradually hindering the investigation for 8 months. When hope seemed lost, a testimony arises. A former colleague of a man named Arthur Lee Allen claims that he told him a plan identical to one of Zodiac's crimes. He said he would sign as Zodiac and used to frequent the area of an official attack. Also, he was fired for harassing minors, which places him at the center of suspicion and gives investigators the feeling of having a thread to pull. For that reason, William, Dave, and another colleague visit him at his workplace. They notice he matches the witness descriptions. He wears a Zodiac watch and boots identical to the prints found at the scene. His answers incriminate him even more, as he was at the same places as the deaths, and on one of those days bloodied knives were found in his car, although he claims they were from some chickens he killed to eat. He even mentions that his favorite book is The Most Dangerous Game. Later at the office they discover more coincidences, such as talks about how to tie a flashlight to a weapon, just like the one used in the Lookout attack. After 8 months of insistence and circumstantial evidence, they finally obtain a search warrant. In his motorhome, they find gloves of the same size and model as those found in the taxi driver's killing, as well as 2 pistols and a rifle, so Leak is taken for final tests. After several hours, Dave and William's superior delivers the results, but unfortunately for the investigators, Leak is not the culprit. The ballistics do not match, nor the fingerprints nor his handwriting. Dave breaks down, kicks his chair, and leaves the office. He confesses to his superior that maybe he was so determined to point to Leak because he can't take it anymore and just wants this to end. To clear his head for a while, the detective goes to the movies with his partner, but his frustration is such that he cannot even concentrate on the film. Outside, Robert reaches him, introduces himself, and tries to encourage him, assuring he will be able to catch the killer. However, Dave subtly confesses that deep down he has already given up. 4 years pass with a couple of important things happening. Paul, trapped in a toxic relationship with alcohol and marked by Zodiac's threats, begins to live an even worse lifestyle. He sleeps in his car, drinks more, and in his eagerness to stay at the forefront of the case, even writes to the Department of Justice to request to be in charge of the investigation on behalf of the newspaper. This earns him a warning call from his superiors, but he tells them to go to hell, saying his work is no longer worthy of a second-rate newspaper, so he resigns. After those 4 years, William, Dave's partner and best friend, requests a transfer to investigate other cases, and says he prefers to see his children grow up. Meanwhile, Robert remains at the Chronicle as a cartoonist. He married the woman from the awkward date and has children with her, but his interest in Zodiac has begun to turn into an obsession. He has hundreds of clippings about the case in a folder, almost all written by Paul, so he comes up with an idea. He goes to visit him, but what he sees disappoints him. Now Paul is deteriorated. He lives in a houseboat and has gone from alcohol to other substances. Robert suggests writing a book about the case, but Paul gets irritated and asks him to leave him alone. However, Robert decides that will be his mission, to write the book to try to connect the pieces the police let slip. His first stop is with Dave, who reminds him that Zodiac had been military. Robert investigates in libraries who borrowed the books with the information needed to create the first codes and discovers that they were actually stolen. Dave is impressed and gives him a name. New thread to pull. Thanks to that, Robert accesses a file warehouse where the case evidence is stored. After reviewing dozens of folders, he discovers that reports testify that hours after Darlene's murder, her father, mother, brother, and father-in-law received strange calls without voice, only heavy breathing. A coincidence suggesting Zodiac knew Darlene and her family. Dave adds that Melvin Belly also received a similar call, leading Robert to visit him. There the housekeeper tells him she spoke with Zodiac and he revealed his birthday. Robert feels he's getting closer to the truth, so he continues. However, his personal life begins to suffer. He starts missing work and his wife grows more distant. While talking to her, he receives a sudden anonymous call. The voice tells him Zodiac is a movie fanatic and that he should look for a man named Bob, supposedly a friend of Zodiac, without knowing it. According to the informant, Bob keeps tapes where Zodiac recorded his victims, a clue that could be key. Before hanging up, the voice reveals Zodiac's name is Rick Marshall. The following night, something very unsettling happens. Robert receives a call with no voices, only deep breathing sounds, and then the call cuts off. just as they called Darlene's relatives after they finished her off. That is a clear threat. But Robert lies to his wife so she won't worry. In the morning, Robert talks with a captain who confirms that Rick Marshall was a suspect but was discarded because they could not compare his handwriting. However, he had a very particular profile. He is an ex-Marine trained in codes and a projectionist in a silent cinema. Dave obtains a poster written by Marshall, and an expert concludes the handwriting matches almost perfectly, though he requests another sample. At the same time, and after 4 years of silence, Zodiac sends a note mentioning Dave and demanding to be left alone. The higher-ups, instead of taking it seriously, believe Dave sent it for publicity and expel him from the homicide division. Robert, more obsessed than ever, gets the phone number of Darlene's sister and even has his children help him with the files, all behind his wife's back. But he makes the mistake of giving a television interview. And if the relationship was already uninteresting for his wife, now that he has revealed his identity, it has become dangerous for the family. The home begins to receive calls at dawn and the woman is fed up, so she confronts him. Robert responds that he really needs to know who the killer is. He needs to look him in the eyes and see his face. His wife asks why he needs to do that, to which Robert responds firmly because no one else will. One night, Robert manages to meet Bob Bone, the man who, according to the anonymous call, knew Zodiac. He travels to his house where they talk, and Robert asks for the tapes that supposedly could contain evidence of the victims, but he makes a mistake. He mentions that the posters examined could incriminate his friend Rick Marshall. Bob, in a somber tone, replies that Marshall did not draw those posters, but he himself made them, and then invites him to go down to the basement to check the tapes. Robert begins to get nervous, although he agrees to go down. His paranoia grows as he feels there is someone else in the house. After confirming that the tapes are useless, he thanks him and runs to the door terrified, but finds it locked. Bob slowly approaches, raises his hand with something in his fist, and it is only the key with which he opens the door. Here we have just seen how good Robert has already reached the point of even risking his own life just to know who Zodiac is. Obviously, this character already shows certain obsessive traits, but I think it is a good metaphor for the level of curiosity these dark worlds can cause in some people. But why? Why are we so captivated by wanting to know more about these topics? After researching, I can summarize the reasons into 3 main motives. The first is the desire to understand why someone would do something so atrocious. Surely many of us who have heard such cases have felt intrigue, wondering why someone would enjoy doing this, why someone feels urges or impulses to kill. From our empathetic perspective, it is completely inconceivable. Secondly, there is the media, which, as I mentioned before, makes the case aesthetic. As if it were a television series with hooks that leave the audience in suspense until the next news or clue appears. And there we, the viewers, play a fundamental role, because through those clues we want to try to put the puzzle together and play detective from our couches. And lastly, and perhaps the core of it all, it may be that throughout our existence as a species, our survival has depended on knowing what can eliminate us. Or as Garrido says, our life has depended on caring about everything that threatens us. So this morbid curiosity could be almost instinctual. After the scare of death, Robert returns home and discovers that his wife has left with their children, leaving only a note asking him not to call her. Still, she leaves him a contact. Linda, the sister of one of Zodiac's victims. Robert interviews her, and she points to a man with a short name as a suspect. Exhausted and with a tired face, Robert insists, "Was it Rick?" He even raises his voice and says, "Just say it. It was Rick Marshall." But Linda remains firm. She does not remember the exact name, but is sure it was not Rick. Before leaving, she finally remembers. It was a certain Lig, Arthur Lig Allen. By this point, Robert's house has completely changed. From a place with children and toys, it has become a place filled with piles of papers. His wife tells him the children miss him, but he himself knows he cannot see them in that state. Still, she gives him a piece of evidence that makes everything fit, and Robert goes to tell Dave everything he has discovered. He tells him about the boots, the watch, the coincidence between Lee's birth date and the calls in which Zodiac said he had to kill on his birthday. He exposes the connections between their timelines. Months after he was fired from a job, the first murder occurred. The letters continued until Dave visited him at work, at which point the letters stopped because they were very close to catching him. 3 years passed without letters until Leek was released from prison for minor offenses, and just then Zodiac began writing again after 4 years of silence. Also in the second crime, Leek was a neighbor of the victim and lived in his mother's basement just a few steps from her. Dave is left breathless. He knows all the evidence is circumstantial and admits, "I can't prove this." Robert responds, "Just because you can't prove it doesn't mean it's not true." Dave ends the conversation asking him to finish the book and then leaves. The next day, Robert visits the store where Leek works. As soon as he sees him, the smile disappears from his face. 7.5 years later, Robert finishes his book, which becomes a bestseller throughout the United States. Meanwhile, an investigator contacts Mike, the young man who survived the first shooting and managed to see the attacker's face. When shown several photos, Mike points almost certainly to Arthur Lee Allen. After this identification, the authorities schedule a meeting to formally accuse him, but Allen dies of a heart attack before it can take place. In 2002, a partial DNA profile is obtained from a 33-year-old Zodiac envelope that does not match Allen. Still, San Francisco and Vallejo investigators refuse to dismiss him. In 2004, San Francisco police closed their investigation, although the case remains open in Napa, Solano, and Vallejo, where Allen continues as the main suspect. Paul Avery dies in 2000 from pulmonary emphysema. Robert Graysmith continues living in San Francisco, maintains a good relationship with his children, and assures he has not received a single anonymous call since Allen's death. In 2021, a group of private investigators called the Casebreakers pointed to Gary Francis, who died in 2018, as a possible suspect for being Zodiac. They argued that scars on his forehead matched the police sketch and that by removing the letters of his name in the killer's ciphers, a hidden message appeared. They also claimed the FBI had considered him a suspect since 2016. However, the authorities were skeptical. The FBI clarified that the case remains open and there is no conclusive evidence confirming this theory. The Zodiac case, beyond the murders, ended up becoming a media spectacle and ultimately turned him into a crime rock star like many others. The problem is that this glorification seems selfish and deeply harmful, because it blurs the line between reality and fiction and gives perpetrators undeserved recognition. Which unfortunately makes us all remember the names of psychopaths but forget those of their victims, real people, real families, and innocent lives lost. Well, I also don't think it's about stopping watching movies or being interested in these events because they are part of history and raise legitimate questions about the human condition. But it is about not losing perspective. The perspective that above every macabre myth and icon there are victims who deserve to be remembered and families who deserve respect. In the end, perhaps true justice is not so much about solving the Zodiac mystery. Perhaps true justice lies in never letting the monsters shine eclipse the memory of those who fell into his hands. Thank you very much for making it to the end of this video. Remember that if you have not subscribed to my channel, you can do it now and you would help me a lot. And you and I will see each other in the next video.